In this lesson, we're going to look at the different respiration methods and look at some of the pros and cons of each. As a review, respiration takes food and makes energy, and that energy is in the form of ATP, which is our cell energy. That's our money for the cells. What are the types of respiration? We have aerobic, which means that we're going to do this process with oxygen. So I kind of remember it as air, there's oxygen in the air, aerobic. Now on the other hand, we have anaerobic. When you put an AN in front of things, it means without. So anaerobic respiration means there's no oxygen present. And we often sometimes call this fermentation. Now that's another name for it. If you see anaerobic respiration or fermentation, they mean the same thing. And there's going to be two types of fermentation that we're going to look at: alcoholic and lactic acid. So here we have Usain Bolt. Now, Usain Bolt can run really, really fast, but only for a relatively short period of time. Because after that, your body basically starts to shut down. And that's because when you run that quickly, you can't take in oxygen fast enough. And so as far as your muscles are concerned, they're running without oxygen. They go into an anaerobic state, and they do what's called lactic acid fermentation. And this is what makes you sore. The same kind of thing happens when, if you're not in that great of shape and you go and work out really hard, you're going to feel really sore the next day. And that's because your cells have been having to do lactic acid fermentation because your body's not good enough at getting oxygen to them. So just remember, lactic acid makes you sore. Now this is yeast. We use yeast to do a slightly different type of anaerobic respiration. Some of you may have seen E85, which is a type of fuel. You may have a flex fuel vehicle, and you can put this in there, and it is 85% ethanol, which is an alcohol. So both of these are involved in alcoholic fermentation. So that we put yeast into solutions in order to have it break down sugars and do alcoholic fermentation to create certain types of beverages or fuels or things like that. This does not happen in your body. So let's compare the two. First off, both of them take glucose. So the primary reactant is going to be glucose. In aerobic, it's going to occur in the mitochondria. And so this means that it pretty much only occurs in eukaryotes because they have mitochondria. Anaerobic happens in the cytoplasm. It can happen in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes because they both have a cytoplasm. And the whole purpose of both of these is to create ATP. So if you notice, both of them take glucose, make ATP. Now, aerobic also takes in oxygen and then also produces carbon dioxide and water. Anaerobic doesn't use anything else, it just uses the glucose, but it produces also carbon dioxide and then either lactic acid or alcohol, depending on which fermentation method we're using. Now, if you notice, there's a difference between the amount of ATPs that are being used. Aerobic, for every molecule of glucose, can make 38 ATP. Anaerobic can only make 2. So if you think about that in terms of money, if you do an hour's work, would you rather get paid $38 or $2? I think everybody would say $38. And so aerobic, we say, is way more efficient. It makes a lot more energy in the form of ATP per molecule of glucose. So if you have the option, you're going to do aerobic. But if for example, you are out of shape and your cells can't get oxygen, they are forced to do anaerobic. So let's look at the full equations. Remember, we are taking glucose, making ATP in both. And so the main differences here are whether or not we have oxygen as a reactant and the fact that we have lactic acid or alcohol when we're doing anaerobic. The energy transformations, and we're going to look kind of at this energy process as a whole. We're starting with solar energy. And so sunlight is going to be transformed through the process of photosynthesis into chemical energy in the form of glucose. So photosynthesis takes sunlight, makes glucose. That glucose is then broken down in the processes of respiration, and that energy is transformed into cellular energy in the form of ATP. So the whole point of this entire thing is to go from sunlight to glucose to ATP. And we use the processes of photosynthesis and respiration to do that. Now, if we look at the products and reactants and how they interact with all of these, remember, photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide, water, and energy, and it's going to make oxygen and glucose. That oxygen and glucose is then a reactant in aerobic respiration to make carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. And if we do anaerobic, we're just going to use that glucose and we're going to make carbon dioxide, ATP, and either lactic acid or alcohol. So the products and the reactants go together. The products of photosynthesis become the reactants for respiration. So here we have another kind of graphical look at this. Solar energy from the sun comes down to the chloroplast. It's going to take in carbon dioxide, and then it's going to transform that energy into glucose and chemical energy through photosynthesis, and it's going to release oxygen. Now that glucose is then going to go to the mitochondria. The mitochondria is going to take in that oxygen that was released during photosynthesis, and it's going to transform that glucose into ATP, or cellular energy. And in the process, it's going to release carbon dioxide. So if you notice, carbon dioxide and oxygen are basically being cycled between these processes. And that's an important concept to see, that we're not really necessarily making and destroying things, we're simply cycling them through.